we've all heard, haven't we, that cow burps are responsible for global climate change, that they're driving global climate change. Well, things are a little bit more complicated than that. Yes, methane is an important greenhouse gas, but it's short-lived. And cows, when they're well managed, can deliver critical ecosystem services that help to restore nature, including processes that help to control and even reduce the impacts of global warming. So I want to tell you the true story of what cows, and in fact what all farmed ruminants, because cattle, sheep and goats all process food in the same way in their ruminants and all deliver food security for different communities around the world. So what all farmed ruminants can do for nature. But before I do, I want to talk about why this confused and sometimes false narrative about cows has emerged and why it dominates. And I'm focusing on the cow because it's become the emblem of this false narrative. So firstly, cows are an easy distraction from fossil fuels. If the people with a vested interest in fossil fuel-based systems can get you to think about cows instead of fossil fuels, then that makes them pretty happy, so they keep on doing it. And frankly, there are some in the farming industry that are making it just too easy for ill-informed journalists and politicians to point the finger. If you think of a beef feedlot, thousands of cows penned in the middle of the desert, then yeah, I'm not disputing that that's a bad system for world ecology, but the cows themselves aren't the problem. It's the fact that there isn't a tree or a blade of grass, that the feed and water has to be imported, that all the grain probably almost certainly comes from petrochemical-reliant arable monocultures, perhaps from places that used to be rainforests. But a regenerative farm, well, that's different. That's a good thing. Regenerative farm systems recruit nature's processes, cycling sunlight and water, building ecological connectivity and harnessing nature's complexity. And yet, sure, these are two extremes, and there are many stages in between, but the point is it's the how and not the cow. The second thing feeding this false narrative is that our scientific and political and editorial processes are really bad at handling complexity. We finally recognize that climate change is a clear and present danger, but this has given many of us carbon tunnel vision, which sounds pretty nasty, right? And this carbon tunnel vision makes people fixate on greenhouse gas emissions, which are important, of course they are, but there are a whole bunch of other critical factors that need to be considered too, because the climate crisis isn't just about greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change is driving and also driven by biodiversity loss. Climate change is driving and also driven by desertification. All these things are connected. And they all threaten human security, food availability, and people's lives and livelihoods. And then finally, we as human beings are obsessed with technology. Technology can get us out of this mess. Well, actually, you know what? Nature can get us out of this mess a whole lot faster, but technology makes money. People can invest in technology, believe in technology, sell technology, get rich from technology. And so the technology story comes to dominate because investors pay PR people to big up what the technology can do. Now, I'm not against technology, of course not. But we do need the right tech in the right places. And when it comes to agriculture and land use, nature, well managed by farmers, can often do things better. So I want to tell you a different story, and let's start with a compost heap, okay? Because we all love compost, right? So a compost heap is a biodigester that takes plant matter, breaks it down, releases a few gases, such as methane along the way, and then at the end, after a few weeks or months, we're left with this fantastic nutrient-dense plant food. Okay, so let's make it a bit more high-tech, because we humans love a bit of high-tech. So imagine a biodigester, okay? A big round industrial compost container. But we still have to feed it because it's just sitting there. So why don't we give it some robot legs so it can move around? And then perhaps a robot munching mechanism so it can gather that plant matter from the ground. Oh, and then we need something at the back end so it can spread that biodigested plant matter on the ground. Now, I don't know what's in your imagination, but the thing in my mind looks kind of familiar. Looks kind of like a cow, a robot cow. Why don't we just use a cow? So this is my story. It's the story of a cow. And this cow can do everything my robot can, but it can do so much more. And here's where things get exciting, because my cow can find its own plant matter. It can search for its own grass and herbs and legumes and leaves and other green things that it eats. And because it has 4 sections in its stomach, it can transform that plant matter super fast into compost amazingly quickly in a matter of hours. And then, when that compost, poo comes out of its back end, it falls on the floor and it gets trampled. And that trampling spreads the manure, moving the nutrients around. And at the same time, the hooves of this heavy animal are breaking up the surface of the soil, allowing more of those nutrients to get inside. And let me be clear, this cow is not in an overstocked feedlot. This is a cow in a regenerative, adaptive multi-paddock system, where there are lots of other cows all doing this at the same time over several days. And then after 3 or 4 days of pretty concerted grazing, my biodigester, my cow, and its biodigester friends all move on to a new paddock, and they won't come back to this paddock for 3 or 4, perhaps even 5 months. And the ground is left to rest and recover. So is that the end of my story? Oh no, because what happens next is thrilling. The earth, the sward with its grass and herbs and legumes, has been covered in a super rich layer of compost. And that makes the sward grow taller, perhaps 3 or 4 feet instead of 1. And it makes the roots grow deeper, breaking apart the earth, creating life inside the ground. This high-functioning grassland, stimulated by regeneratively managed cows, is astonishing stuff. Now, when it rains, all that tall grass slows the flow of the rainfall towards the ground. And the deep roots mean that the soil, particularly at the surface, has become soft, allowing more of that rain to get inside. And then the earth holds the water in a soil carbon sponge, which is like a great reservoir beneath the ground, and then releases it as the plants demand it, allowing green growth throughout the year. And this grassland, because it's sward, its biomass is greater, delivers faster transpiration, the transfer of water from liquid into gas, and this transpiration produces hydroxyl ions, which are the laundry process of the skies. In fact, high-functioning grassland can produce many, many times the hydroxyl cleanup capacity required to break down the methane that my regeneratively grazing cows have been producing. But these hydroxyls also clean and filter other pollutants and gases, such as particulate carbon and carbon monoxide from the atmosphere as well. And because this transpiration is moving water from the ground into the sky, clouds form. And white clouds high up in the atmosphere are super important for reflecting some of the sun's energy back out into space, and therefore helping to regulate the Earth's temperature. And because of the busy action of these hydroxyl ions, when the clouds gather and darken and finally burst, the water that falls as rain has been laundered and is clean and fresh. Let's go back to the ground, because in this high-performing pasture, stimulated by grazing cows, when the sun shines, the soil is protected. The ground is so well covered that the earth inside the sward stays at about 20 degrees C, even in a heat wave, where if the land was bare, it would quickly reach temperatures of 60, even 70 degrees centigrade. And because the ground is cooler, it re-radiates much less heat back up out into the atmosphere. So just by keeping the earth covered well, our cow has delivered a cooling effect. What's happening inside the sward itself? Well, the dunging and trampling of our herders unlock nutrients and other processes in the soil. Seeds that have been dormant for decades may be newly awakened. The sward itself becomes more diverse, growing dozens of different plants, which attracts a greater diversity of insects, more butterflies and bees, and then more birds. As life attracts life, biodiversity thrives and cascades upwards through the soil and outwards through the fields and hedgerows, as snails and spiders and beetles become food for bigger creatures that import seeds from wilder places, like riverbanks and woodlands, on their feathers, their fur, and in their poo. And because the grass is tall, the roots go deep, penetrating the earth. And as these roots thrive and die and thrive again, they create millions of tiny pathways. Mycorrhizal fungi spreads. Arthropods and bacteria work away below ground, creating invisible cities, bustling and bursting with ecology. And this leads to a great acceleration in the production of soil organic matter as these creatures live out their life cycles, predating on each other, excreting, reproducing, moving, tunneling deep and shallow beneath the Earth's surface. Nature's complexity and resilience is gradually restored. And as the soil organic matter grows, as the sward's biomass builds, this captures carbon from the air and then sequesters it, locking it inside the ground. All these processes because of a cow. So back to the climate crisis. What has our cow achieved? Well, there's carbon being absorbed from the atmosphere. All that tall grass and ground cover are helping to increase transpiration and reduce temperatures. Hydroxyls are cleaning the air. When it rains, the soil carbon sponge and deep roots hold more water, reducing runoff and avoiding flooding downstream. And then when that water is released, it helps to produce not only food for microorganisms and arthropods, but green grass for our cow and for everything in between. The whole food web is supported. And not only that, but our cow, this magnificent biodigester, evolved by nature and managed by farmers, produces milk for people to drink, or eat as cheese and ice cream, and produces meat for people to eat as steaks and burgers. And because ultimately people want to eat that cow and drink the milk that our amazing biodigester produces, our farmer is able to earn a living, is able to get paid for looking after that animal throughout its life and managing it to achieve these incredible ecosystem functions. And of course, the money that that farmer earns then goes to feed that farmer's family and to buy other things that stimulate and support the countryside economy, which, as that money changes hands, gradually cascades, supporting urban economies as well. All that from our cow. Climate mitigation and adaptation, global cooling, biodiversity regeneration, food security, income for our farmers, and economic stimulation, all from our cow. So yes, we do need cows to help us solve the climate crisis because nature is connected. And our cow, an ecosystem engineer, helps to tie nature's processes back together. It's a good story, right? It's a great story. But I know that there's an elephant in the room. I know that you've heard that cows are four-legged horned beasts that pump methane from their mouths and from their bottoms. And that's true. They do, but ruminants have existed for millions of years. A cow burp in a short natural cycle is not the same as fossil methane from oil and gas extraction that's taken millions of years to form. Ruminants, wild and more recently domestic, have always burped methane, and their burps have always been recycled. Before the Industrial Revolution, the amount of methane in our atmosphere was stable for tens of thousands of years. The hydroxyls from high-functioning ecosystems always cleaned them from the air. So what's changed? We discovered fossil fuels. And we have presided over a perilous destruction of our Earth's ecology. Remember what I said at the start about distraction? It's fossil fuels. And intensive fossil fuel-based systems, including fossil fuel-reliant farm systems, they're the problem. It's the destruction of our Earth's ecology. That's the problem. And let's be really clear. The carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels can exist for 1,000 years, warming our atmosphere, while methane is a short-lived gas with a half-life of about 10 years. After 20 years, almost all of its warming impact, which begins as a burst and then peters out, has disappeared. So, imagine a herd of 100 cows. It could be 100, it could be 1,000,000. And after 20 years, providing their number has not increased, and actually that it's dwindled just a little at 0.3% each year, while their methane emissions continue, there is no new warming from that herd. Each emission simply replaces another. There was a pulse of warming when that herd was first established way back when, but there's no additional ongoing warming from that herd. So, where does this bring us in terms of the here and now? Well, since the year 2000, about 20 years ago, the number of cattle on the planet has increased by 14%, so that needs to be reversed, and quickly. Then we need to factor in that 0.3% annual reduction, which is about 6% over 20 years, bringing us to a total reduction requirement of around about 20%. And when we've delivered that 20% reduction, we'll be at net zero warming in terms of cattle methane. And importantly, we can achieve this simply by ending the most fossil fuel-reliant forms of cattle production. And in terms of the UK, well, our cattle numbers have already reduced. We're already below net zero warming in terms of cattle methane. So where has this distorted message about ruminant methane come from? Well, it's simply that we've been measuring its impact using an inaccurate metric, one that treats all gases as though they behave in the same way as the long-lived carbon dioxide, or CO2. But now a revised metric exists, GWP star, and this tells us the truth. The research from the University of Oxford was led by Professor Miles Allen, a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in its recent sixth assessment report, the IPCC accepted that the common metric for assessing global warming potential overstates the impact of stable, ongoing emissions from short-lived gases such as methane by a factor of 3 to 4. 3 to 4. Now that's huge. And when we use the revised metric, the global warming impact of the methane from a farm with ruminants typically falls by 70%. Methane from ruminants, yeah, it's important, but it's not a primary cause of global warming. It's fossil fuels. It's the degradation of our ecology. So let's bring all this together. Let's put things into context. Let's try and heal the damage caused by carbon tunnel vision. Our cow, yes, she produces some methane, just like our compost heap. But the climate crisis isn't just about greenhouse gas emissions. And yet we do need an urgent end to fossil fuel-reliant agriculture, dependent on imported feed, on deforestation and petrochemicals, but in a regenerative farm system, producing high-functioning grassland. Our cow helps the soil to sequester carbon. She restores land and ecological function, helping us to solve the climate crisis, while at the same time producing fantastic nutrient-dense food, supporting livelihoods, and feeding communities right the way around the world. Cows, in fact, all ruminants, they're remarkable creatures. And we can't solve the climate crisis without them. Thank you.